It's theory time, buckaroos. Alrighty, welcome back to Final Fantasy VII Theory. I want to thank everybody who has dropped their own theories down in the comments on the previous videos, and everyone that's just talked about the Final Fantasy VII theories in general. You know, it's not about who's right and who's wrong, which theory is correct, which one is not, but it's more about the what ifs. You know, what if these theories were true? What kind of implications would that have on one of our favorite games, and the implications it would have on our favorite characters. In that spirit, I definitely have a juicy theory for you today, but before we get to that, I need to go back to the previous theory and shout out my boy Hedron. Hedron left an amazing comment on the previous theory about the summons potentially being ancient Cetra warriors. One of my favorite places to go while researching Final Fantasy stuff is the Lifestream.net, and Hedron left a particular page on that site that I had not come across while researching the summons are Cetra theory. This page is called the Unused Text, and it documents a bunch of the dummied content in Final Fantasy VII in regards to text conversations with the characters. Now, Final Fantasy VII in general has a ton of dummied content, and you can't necessarily take the dummied content and use it for particular theories, because it might be content that they chose to leave out because it didn't fit with the story anymore, not just because they didn't have enough time to implement it. However, it is incredible to see that one of these theories that we come up with as a community may have actually been a thought that the developers had as they were creating the game. And that is exactly what we have here. We have some unused text from the Temple of the Ancients, a conversation between Sephiroth and Aeris that goes as follows. Sephiroth says, during the time when the ancients prospered, there existed beings that were brought up bathed in the light of abundant Mako. They were pure creatures of natural shape. Several types remain even now. Some of these beings sealed their life energy within materia, altering their lives forever. Aerith says, the summon materia, in which Sephiroth responds, correct, such a clever girl. Now, this is the only text we know of that explains the origins of the summons, and later it was removed. So either A, they just decided not to use it, or B, they changed what they decided the origins of summons was going to be. Although we don't know if these beings that existed during the time of the ancients were also ancients, or they were monsters, or there was something in between. We also don't know how long this process takes. In fact, we could say that the red dragon that we defeat in the Temple of the Ancients turned into Bahamut. And we could also say that some of the materia that Jenova drops could also be somehow ancient warriors that Jenova captured within her body or something like that. There are so many cool ideas that could come from this, and I'd love to see some more discussion on it. But for now, let's get to today's theory. Is Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X connected? Now, I have a long history with this theory, so let me throw in a little bit of my bias before we go to the research. The thought of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, as well as a lot of the other Final Fantasies all being connected, is a popular discussion on my channel, and I have always hated it. Final Fantasy VII is the game that got me into gaming, and when I played Final Fantasy VIII as a kid, I kinda wondered why they didn't continue with Cloud and Sephiroth and all those cool characters that I knew from the first one I played. However, I quickly realized even back then that Square had this amazing series that no one else really had. They had the ability through this series to tell all sorts of different character stories and all sorts of different plots with the same type of elements and the same main theme of a bunch of unlikely characters getting together to save the world. That core theme is what kept me coming back to Final Fantasy. Every time I bought a new game, I always wanted to see how those unlikely characters came together once again to stop some kind of huge evil force. To me, it was always important that the stories were kept completely separate. Any attempt to try to connect them would ruin the magic for me. Therefore, whenever anyone stops by my live stream and talks about how the Final Fantasies are connected, my response was usually always, that's a great fan theory, but I'm not on board. However, to ignore these theories would be a disservice. I mean, some of them have a little bit of research behind them, but others have a ton of research into them. It's gotten to the point now where even the developers seem to be putting little hints here and there, trying to show us how the realms might be connected. The problem is, it can be hard to tell if some of these hints are just Easter eggs, or if they're actual proof towards connections of the games. This leads us to the Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X theory, which has probably the biggest piece of proof you could ever ask for. In Final Fantasy X-2, there's an Albed character by the name of Shinra. Grade A originality. Shinra talks about far-plane data and how he thinks it's the life force of the planet. which makes the Final Fantasy X planet seem a lot like the Final Fantasy VII planet, and the far plane seem a lot like the Lifestream. He then says that his studying would take generations, which gives us the idea that he might be a distant ancestor of President Shinra. There's also some smaller connections like the Fireflies and how Kadaj dies in Advent Children, and also the far plane in connection with the Promised Land. This all seems to be just Easter eggy stuff though. I mean, the character's name being Shinra is a little bit on the nose, and the fact that all this happens in Final Fantasy X-2, a game that's a lot more lighthearted and silly with its story, seems to signify that this is all just silly references. However, then we get into a very interesting interview with Nojima, who is the scenario writer for 7 and 10, who says this. After quitting the Gullwings, Shinra received enormous financial support from Rin, and began trying to use Vegnagun to siphon Mako energy from the far plane. But he is unable to complete the system for utilizing this energy in his generation, and in the future, when traveling to distant planets becomes possible, the Shinra Company is founded on another world. That would happen about 1,000 years after this story. Whoa, no, wait, what? What? This puts a huge wrench in everything. First of all, Shinra travels from the world of Final Fantasy X to the world of Final Fantasy VII. In that case, we can throw out everything that we just said previously, because all that far plane and Firefly and all that stuff was happening on the Final Fantasy X planet. But now we're on a whole new planet, so they're not connected. But they are. They're in the same universe, but not the same planet. This would also mean that all the descendants of Shinra are Al Bhed, and that there could be more characters from Final Fantasy X that moved over to the Final Fantasy VII planet. And this could have happened during the time of the Cetra. Final Fantasy X could have been happening during the time of the Cetra in Final Fantasy VII, and then they moved over afterwards. Like, there's so many different possibilities. This also means that potentially all the Final Fantasies are happening at the same time, just on different planets. And if Final Fantasy X's planet works very similarly to the way that Final Fantasy VII's planet works, then maybe all the planets work that way. Maybe they all have some kind of life stream or far plane energy that controls the planet. Now, I do want to be clear that even though Nojima said this, it doesn't necessarily make it 100% completely true over the span of the entire series. There have been many times where directors and scenario writers have said something during an interview and changed their mind later, or just not remembered things correctly, or just were caught off guard and said something that they didn't really mean, etc., etc. It does stand that Shinra is definitely in the game, but whether or not this was an idea that the entire crew decided on when they put Shinra in the game, or just some offhanded comment that Nojima made, we don't know. This interview, however, is published in the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega Guide, so it does seem pretty legit. So what do you guys think? Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, are they connected? And if they are, what are the implications? What does this mean for Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, and the whole rest of the series? I don't know if there's enough proof here, and I don't know if we can take one singular interview and just use that as ammo to guide all the other theories that we create, but it's a really fun one to talk about the what ifs. Also, just a public service announcement, even if you have one piece of evidence that seems pretty solid, that doesn't mean that you can just throw out everyone else's opinions. In the world of Final Fantasy, video games, movies, books, and all sorts of published media, there's always going to be proof coming in from every different side. The book might say one thing, the author might forget what they wrote and say something else, the movie adaptation might get something different wrong. In the end, when we make fan theories like this about our favorite media, we have to take evidence from all over the spectrum and come up with a theory that makes the most sense to us. So please, take everybody's evidence into consideration and be humble. Be sure to leave me some more crazy theories down below so we can continue this awesome series, and I'll see you in the next one.